Alright, well I want to assess the project that we've got going here, and what we decided that we're going to do is we've removed the carpet inlays on this hardwood floor, and we're going to replace them with the Milestone hybridized Portland cement inlay. And so I'm going to make it come out flush with the surrounding hardwood. And I have two areas here I'm doing in this hallway, and I'm going to bring my my Milestone cement right over the edge and have it be the nose of the top step. And to set this up for this, and you'll want to do this on any kind of a plywood floor, most plywood's going to have some movement on the joints in the plywood if it's going crossways on the joists. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add a layer of plywood over the top of this. That could be any layer, any thickness of plywood from 1/4 inch on up would probably be sufficient. But because we want to level out with this surrounding hardwood, we're going to use 3/8 plywood, and we're going to consider that our composite of metal lath and Milestone plaster is going to comprise the other 3/8. And I want to do it at that dimension because I know I can easily fit my matrix of mesh and cement and Milestone into a 3/8 inch space. But I wouldn't want to have to fill up the whole 3/4 of an inch with Milestone, and plus I want that extra reinforcement on all of the joints because I don't want to have the possibility of movement telegraphing through my floor with a crack over time. I'm going to try to make this as a bulletproof a type of installation as I can, and that's why I'm going in that direction. You could go right over this plywood directly with your metal lath. You just do risk movement at the joints if you do that. So I'm going to try to always tell you the best way to do things, not that there aren't other ways that you could do it as well. And so the very first thing in assessing this particular floor has an irregularity in it where we're going to have to fill it up about a 1/2 inch. They apparently had used some sort of a gypsum fix-all, which you'll notice didn't stick very well to the plywood, which is why we'll use the Milestone cement to do that. And then I'll probably just use a thin set mortar with a notch trowel to bed my plywood after I get this patch leveled out. And then I'll nail the plywood down good, especially at the joints and the seams. And then we'll nail down a layer of metal lath, or screw down a layer of metal lath over the whole floor. And then we'll plaster that out. We want to protect the surrounding area before we start any work at all here. And so the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to tape off the perimeter, and I've got tape and paper from my dispenser, and I'm going to hold this back as I install it about a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch from the edge all the way around as I do it. And the reason I'm doing that is this protection that I'm putting down right now is going to stay down throughout the entire course of the project. And that's one of the reasons I use the blue tape, is so that the blue tape is able to be down for several weeks at a time if it's not in the direct sunlight. And we're just going to put this perimeter part down, and we will be leaving it down. And then I'm going to double tape over the top of that. Just this last 1/2 inch I'll tape right to the edge of my woodwork, and this will protect the woodwork. But this piece of tape, each time I do an application or a coat of Milestone or cement, I will be pulling this and retaping this one piece, but the rest of the perimeter of this protection gets to stay down from now to the very end of the project. Okay, I have a mixture of Milestone E liquid And actually I did not use hybridized Portland cement on this. I used just regular Portland cement that you could buy at any lumber store. And I used a number 70 grit sand because it's a real fine grit sand. It'll add good bulk to our mixture here. Now you want the mixture wet enough so it can saturate the underneath plywood if you want it to stick good. But for this particular patch, we also want it dry enough so I can get a little buildup on this. And you notice I'm kind of forcing it in contact with that underneath surface, not just skimming it over the top. I want to make sure it gets down and attaches itself to that base. And so I'm just going to sort of now take my 12-inch cement trowel here and just kind of level this off good with the existing floor. And I've got actually about a 1/2 inch fill going here in the back part. At least a half. I've done floors where we've filled the whole entire floor up 3/4 of an inch before. That takes a little bit of multiple layers and multiple coats because there's a lot of suction. So these acrylics are kind of sticky, so they're hard to get a real nice smooth trowel all in one pass, and it's almost better sometimes not to try to do it all in one pass. But for what we're doing this little patch here, we're going to go ahead and just sort of do this. We're going to be going over this with our plywood anyway, so I'm not going to worry about trying to get this perfect. And I think I can saw this out good enough with just this. I'm going to come a little bit more this way. And this is a 1 part 70 grit sand, 1 part cement by volume is the mix that we're actually doing here. And then just as much E as is needed to wet it to the whatever consistency you like working with for the job you're doing is always how I do the mix ratio on the sand to cement. What we've done is we've cut all of the sheets of plywood for the whole area inlay that we're going to do. And I'm not really worried too much about the fits on the joints, but they actually are pretty tight fits here because we're going to be filling that in anyway. But I want to bed these sheets down with some thin set mortar, which is why I have all of them in place and have them all cut first. Because what I want to do is one at a time, peel the pieces up and bed that piece, nail that down, and then do the next piece. And you don't want to, if you're going to be using a mortar to bed your plywood with, you don't want to do one piece at a time and then go cut and fit and come back and have your mortar mixed for a long period of time. It's best to mix the mortar and use it as quickly as you can. You probably, with this particular kind, we have a couple hours to use it up. But I wouldn't want to let it sit here the whole time I was cutting and fitting. So we've got all of our pieces cut and fit, and this would be the same rule if you were doing cement board or any other kind of plywood, hardy board, tile back, or any of those. You would do the same thing. Get all your pieces cut and then do your mix to bedding. Okay, well here we have our thin set mortar, and this is the reason I'm not using Milestone for this job is it does dry too fast to be able to do the notch trowel and get the piece over to it and bed the piece in it. So I use a thin set mortar for this. And I'll move the bucket so you can kind of see how I'm filling. And the idea is that we just want a nice bed so that there's not going to be any movement to our piece when we get it nailed in here, not now and not in the future. This will give it a nice solid bed to sit on, but it also is an adhesive that will cause it to stick to this base as well. So if you're going to go over plywood, you want to use a thin set that's been made for that task. They have different types of thin sets that are used for different situations. You want a polymer modified one if you're going over a plywood substrate. Take now now we've got our mud spread over this first area. We're going to take our first piece of plywood and drop it into the mud. You want to get right on it, and you want to get it bedded right away. You don't want to let that set for long periods of time. It'll dry out, and then you won't get it to all flatten out the same. By the way, it's a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch notch trowel is the size of notch trowel I used on this. And we're going to just use galvanized roofing nails, and we're going to nail this around the perimeter. On this 3/8 plywood, I'm going to nail it about every 4 to 5 inches all the way around the perimeter, and about every 9 inches throughout the field. And that should hold it good, especially with that thin set mortar acting as a glue as well. Okay, what we're going to do before we put our metal lath down is we're going to put a quick kind of a primer on this floor. And this is just E, and I'm just going to put a real thin coat of E, and that will cut the suction of the plywood some, and that will allow our E, when we put it on there, will allow it to bond a little better. So this will act as a bit of a primer for us. And I'm not trying to get any build up, but just a quick coat to just give a little bit of sealer. I don't want to totally seal it and encapsulate it. I still want it to be able to wick into the plywood grain. I just don't want to starve the joint of the two by having it be as dry as this plywood is. So I'm just going to quickly put a coat of this over the whole entire surface. We've cut all of our metal lath. Now when I cut the metal lath to go over the top of the plywood, I don't overlap the seams. Then I lose that flat surface of the plywood that's so nice for us to just follow through with our different coats. And if I overlap it and double it up, then I have to level the whole floor out to match that. And I feel like the plywood itself becomes a backing piece on the seam, so I'm not even going to worry about it. Another thing that I've done is I've made sure I haven't lined up any of my other seams in my metal lath with the seams in the plywood. I've always made sure that they are staggered. It's okay that you have to cross them at a 90. There's really almost no way around that. But I didn't want to have to ever have the seam of the plywood line up with the seam of the metal lath. And I feel like you fasten the metal lath down about the same amount that we did the plywood, so probably every 3 or 4 inches. I am using a screw that's a Durarock style screw. It has a head that's a very narrow head, narrow in the depth of it this way, so it sets down pretty flat to the metal lath. And it also works very good for cement board. That's what these are designed for. They have a coating on them to make them rust resistant. And the head is big enough so that it won't go through the holes in the metal lath. Okay, well, we're going to start plastering now. And you want to keep the mix wet enough so that it's going to have a good flow over the surface under us. So if our mix thickens up a little on us, we'll add a little more acrylic to it to thin it back down so it's a good consistency to have a good wetting flow over the surfaces that we're trying to bond to. And I'm just going to try this. I'm going to make sure I force it down through the mesh everywhere so I get a good bond. And you don't want to just scrape it over the top and then have it not actually even go through the mesh. So I'm going to force it down good on this coat, and I will do the whole layer. Across the floor, our mix has kind of thickened a little bit on us, and because I don't have a whole lot of mix left, I'm going to just take a little bit of the E that we've been working with and just sort of hand thin this down and just hand stir it, because I don't like it. It's a little hard and then it doesn't bond as good. if you let it get too stiff. It takes a few quick stirs to kind of loosen it up and get it back to a nice consistency to work with. And you can do that over and over. I try to probably not do it to the same mix for more than a couple hours, but I have used mixes off and on throughout the day that I've had to thin numerous times. Okay, well, I saved this last little bit by the stairs here so I can show you how I would do the stairs. And whenever you have a vertical surface, it's a little different. You don't just get to dump your cement mortar mix out onto it. So the tool I have in my hand here is called a hot, kind of like a palette that an artist would use. Put your material on it and work from that. And so I'm gonna just kind of do this a nice coat here, but as I do the face, I'm gonna work the face with the, I'm gonna try to have my hot under me a little here so I do drop any mud, I can do that. But I'm going to make sure I get good penetration on my face as I go across. And we're going to bring the nose of the step right around and pin it down just so it has that nice look of the floor having some dimension and depth to it, so it doesn't just look like a surface coating. And this could be any depth high. And this would be the same kind of a technique you would use on a countertop edge as well. In fact, this whole series of everything that we're doing is exactly how I do my concrete or my Milestone cement countertop. So I'll just kind of keep that in mind if you ever want to do a countertop that is pretty much the same procedure as the floor. Okay, what we're going to do now, this has taken up a little bit. It's not hard yet, but it's hard enough in the surface that I can actually sort of knock off some of the sand cracks from my trolley. And I'll just kind of scrape those down just a little bit. You want to wait till it's dry enough so that it's not any kind of a liquid anymore, but if you wait till the next day to do this, these are really hard and they'll be very, very difficult to knock down then. So that when you're troweling it out on your base, that's why you would see those ridges in mine. I'm not fighting trying to get it perfectly smooth because I know that I'm going to come back and sort of carve off my high spots. And I'm going to use a little bit longer trowel on this coat so I can get it nice and flat. And I'm not walking on it yet. If you had a big floor where you had to walk on it, you let it take up just a little more than we have, and you would be able to walk on it maybe with like little boards that you could move around, leapfrog around on it. We use 1/4 inch masonite. I do usually like to put visqueen over the masonite if I'm going to do that, just to keep it from sucking the moisture on the floor. Okay, well that's pretty prepped out now for me, and that didn't take too much. I'm going to go ahead and start my next coat, and I'm going to use a combination of my different trowels that I've got here so that I can get a nice, this coat I'm really going to work to keep it pretty much flat with the material I've been doing, but at the same time, if there's any filling or leveling, I'm going to be working to kind of do that as I go here. And again, you want your mix wet enough so that it wets the surface you're going over and it has a good flow to it. And this is just on the edge. This is starting to get a little stiff for me, so I need to thin it just a touch. Do you have any E there, Doc? That's supposed to be a hit. And I'm going to purposefully make sure, no matter what my floor is doing, I gotta stay just a little bit down from this wood so that my final coat of glass, or my aggregate finish that I'm gonna do for my final pass, I want to just have this a little over a 16th down, not quite an eighth. And I'm just going to sort of estimate that as I go. Trying to make sure that I'm kind of watching the lines that my trowel makes, and that I'm getting it nice and flat, especially on the edges. So I'm kind of going at each area from a couple of different angles as I'm doing it. And I'm trying to make sure that I'm watching the patterns of trowel marks that my trowel makes, so I know that I'm getting it nice and flat. And like before, I'm going to try to finish this last little section with the hawk and the trowel, but I'm going to first finish leveling the top in. And I just got just a little bit of area where I can tell it would be good to put a little tiny bit of mud. And now I'm going to use the hawk and trowel again on this edge, and I'm finding this kind of nice to have the hawk shoved right up to this. I'm really not using much of the normal technique on this. It's keeping me from making a mess on my steps below it. It's kind of nice. Once again, keep in mind, we set this up for about a 3/8 fill here, and we did the mesh. Now we're doing a second coat over it to level it out, and it's coming out just about perfectly set up for our final coat without much extra effort in how we're putting this on there. So it just sort of tells you that's why I always say 3/8, and it always is enough. It's not a whole bunch of excess, but it's definitely just enough with the way the mesh is fastened down. Okay, well, we've moved around to give you a little better shot of what I'm doing here. And I'm just going to kind of work a little bit of mud up here. Now, I didn't run my metal lath back in under. I just ran it down the face. And I made sure it didn't hang down below my steps, that it just came right down flush or above the wood just a little bit. And I made sure also when we did our substructure that we nailed the plywood down real good here, because we don't want any movement in this nose of our step here. And I'm just kind of doing just a little real thin coat under there. Just put a little mud there. The reason I didn't run the metal lath there, it was very difficult to do a neat job of it. And there's no chance if I were to get a little crack on the back side of this, there's nowhere that you can get that you can see that unless you're using mirrors. And I'm going to have a problem with that one. So I'm going to make sure I have enough build up on here so I've got something to sand when I come back in about a half hour or an hour. And we'll lightly sand and scrape and kind of fuss with our edges and our corners a little bit. So if I'm leaving a little excess on here right now, that's totally all right, because I know that I can come back and shape that as long as I do it tonight. If I do it tomorrow, it's going to be a lot of work. You wouldn't want to do it this way. It'd be better to just take her nice and tight and then tomorrow add a little more on, rather than try and get your build up all at once. But I'm trying to get enough of the buildup here so in one time I can come back and I'll be able to kind of carve this into shape. Okay, this has been about an hour and a half to 2 hours since we did our finishes on this, and it's taken up quite a bit. I'm not going to get out and walk on it. It's not quite as far along as I'd like, but in order to press this on, we're going to go ahead and do it right now. I'm going to start off by arming myself with a little sandpaper here on a sanding pad. And this is the same kind of sanding pad that they use to do drywall sheetrock type work. And I tend to buy my own paper and rip it in half and just install it on the sanding pad myself. I know you can buy special paper made for these sanding pads, but this is I get the option of whatever kind of grit I want by doing it this way, because they only sell certain grits when you buy their paper, and it also is a little cheaper this way. And so I'll show you how I install it as we kind of one of those little hints to help you have an easier time of it. So I kind of stretch the paper onto the base of the sanding pad, tighten it down. Now I always bias my paper to one side so that I can stand up next to my woodwork or into the corners and have it be supported by the pad. Then I just let the other side float sort of freely. I'm going to use my trowel as a kind of a scraper tool to help me get it nice and flat. And this is at a great stage for being able to do this. And this way I can really control the height of the plaster. It'll be hard for me to talk over the scraping, so I'll try to talk and scrape, but not at the same time. And we're also, when we get done here scraping this, we're going to pull all of our tape on the edge, and then we will retape that edge later. Now I can really control how far down I am on my woodwork as I go around it. So you can see how flat I am. And I'm not trying to make it all scraped exactly the same size, but I'm trying to make sure I'm about the same distance down on my woodwork all the way around. And then for the little bumps. Now the next coat I'm going to do is a sand coat, and it can go on not an 1/8 of an inch, but it can go on up to probably about an 1/8 of an inch thick all at once. I will let this coat totally dry before I do that, which probably would mean tomorrow. This is about a strong 1/4 of an inch thick, and it will dry overnight and be dry enough tomorrow. So we could put the finishes on tomorrow. In real time, all of this, including all the dry times and everything, has taken place in the last 8 to 9 hours of elapsed time. It didn't take us that long to do everything. We went out to dinner and we've taken breaks and paused for many things that we've been doing. But just so you kind of get an idea, and we have here about 60 square feet of surface area is what we're dealing with. With my trowel, but I also have the sanding pad that we set up. And if you're at the right point on this slab, you can sand this whole slab, and you won't ever wear the grit out on the sandpaper. If you're a little early, it'll plug. But if you waited till tomorrow to do this, this would be impossible. So you always want to do this the same day, like we did, an hour or two later if it's this 1/4 of an inch thick. If it's really hot out, you might have to be on it a little faster than that. I'm going to kind of cut my edges in with the sanding pad just to make sure I'm right up tight to the woodwork. And I can really see now how nicely I'm following my hardwood floor. Sorry about the noise of the sanding pad. And the other thing I'm going to do as we go around right now is I'm going to pull the tape around the perimeter of the floor. If I leave this tape, it just gets so hard to pull. It's not quite as bad as when you come down to a floor at a 90. You never leave it if your floor is at a 90-degree angle. But even this floor, being at a kind of a flat plane with the surface, it still gets a lot harder to pull if you wait till the next day. And it pulls so easy right now, and you really, because it gets kind of beat up and everything, you really want to replace it every time to get good protection out of it. And I'm gonna go ahead and pull it around the perimeter here. That'll work. Stairs take a little extra attention, as do countertops and any kind of an edge. And we could have used a straight edge to apply this, but I just put a little extra on her. And so I'm going to use a straight edge to sort of take a little off and sort of make it match right into where it needs to be. And I'm going to scrape it a little bit here because it's in. I'm going to position that just right. On longer surfaces, you may find yourself actually wanting to fasten your straight edge down with you can use a 1x4 or a 2x4. Nice thing about a 2x4 is that it will give you a little bit of surface to guide yourself at a 90-degree angle to. So you flatten your top surface first, and then you can come through, scrape a little bit, and then you can sand it, and you can actually let the straight edge be a little bit of the guide to get you perpendicular to the floor. You actually can even use this square and pull it across at the end to check it. Ours looks pretty good here, so I'm not going to bother with that. And this is my substrate, so I will be getting to finish over this, but we're just kind of taking it nice and clean it up just right. Now, just make sure it's not sticking out too far anywhere or down too far so that later it ends up looking bad. And you can kind of see some of the surfaces just carve as I do this. And I'm not working real hard at this. This is just kind of almost melts with the. And I'm trying to keep my tool pretty plumb as I pull it across here. Okay, so now that's straightened out pretty good. Now I'm just going to lightly ease the corner. Actually, you can even wait till the next day to do that if you want, if it's a little tender. But you can just see how nice this is at a state where it's carved. It just sort of melts. I'm not using any pressure. I'm just sort of floating my little tool across there. And I could even put the straight edge here if I needed to straighten the bottom edge out. And it could even be fastened there, and I do that on countertops. But I wouldn't on a short step like this because it's guides so nicely by the surface that's there. So, there you have it. That's the way that you shape this base coat for this finish that we're doing. Okay, well, our floor is now dry enough to put our next coat on. And we have set up to do an aggregate finish on this. So we've done some samples, and I wanted to show you our sample. And we have several hundred square feet of this we're doing throughout the house. So we were looking for a sample that had nice coloration movement to it, that blended well with our woodwork. So we did several samples, and I'll kind of show you that. Partly to explain that it's very important to do samples. And doing your samples, you learn how to do the finish as well as how the finish is going to look when you get done. And these samples have the sealers on them, as well as all the slurry and everything, because we want them to look exactly like the finished product, sheen and everything. And we use two different colors kind of blended together at the same time to do this. And then we washed it over at the end with a slurry, and we'll show you that as we go through the process here. And this is a recycled glass sample. We've used 3 colors of glass kind of blended. We used a black, which is kind of a little peppering that shows up pretty bold in the surface. And then we've also used a amber colored glass that contributes to the look of the finish, but it's very subtle when you have an amber background like this especially. And then we've used some gray, which is also fairly subtle, but it plays a little more in the finish than amber does. And I'll flip the sample over now, and you can see when we do our samples, we always write the formula on the back side of them. This has the 2 colors, the pale yellow and the gold. These formulas are written the same way you would write formulas for any latex paint. And we've got all the different notes about sealers and everything on this one. So we'll be blending these 2 colors with our trowel, creating the movement of the piece as we go. Okay, well, I'm going to start in plastering. We have our gold and our pale yellow. I'm going to just kind of work with equal parts of each as we go, and I'm not even going to worry too much about cross-contamination either. And keep in mind, if your mix thickens, you'll want to thin it as you go, and you want to keep it wet enough the whole time that you're able to get good flow over the floor for bonding. So don't let your mixes get real thick on you. Just go thin them if that happens. And you can kind of see, I think, through the video about the consistency I'm working with. And I'm going to fill up with this pass pretty much all the way to the top of my wood from the last pass, but I'm not going to worry too much about the color of this base, because the top will really control the final color of what we're doing. We're going to put 2 coats on. Our first coat, we're going to coat this floor out, and we're going to let that take up good, and then we'll come back with our second coat, and that'll be our finish coat. With this first coat on this particular finish, which we call a Bergamo, we're making a bed for the glass in the next coat to push down into. So the next coat will be really troweled as thin as we can get it to go. So this coat will put on her nice and even, just about perfect to the top of the wood. And then the next coat will just be as thin as we can do it. And that'll be the coat where we really worry about all of our coats. Okay, now we're going to do the edge for you here. I'm going to show you how we handle the nose on the step, or it could be a countertop if we're doing the same finish on a countertop. Normally on the glass finishes, we put it on just the thickness that the aggregate will allow us to put it on. Here we've kind of been raising it a little bit to match the wood level. The next coat will be done the thickness the glass will allow us to do. And I'm just going to sort of come across here and make sure we get this nice and straight. Now we straighten our base out good, so this pretty much we should be able to follow that. And I want to end up flush with the wood here on the end. And I'm going to have my guy just help me, and we're going to hold that level as a, using it not as a level, but as a straight edge across the edge here. Get this off a little bit. Okay, just sort of lay this I'll line it up right where I want it. Just keep a little bit of weight on it. That way we can tell if we're really right out there straight where we need to be. Yeah, that looks pretty good. It's just going to cheat a little bit here so we know we get it where we want. I'm just kind of blending this as I go, the two different colors, and I'm not worried about, on this base coat anyway, too much of the look of what I've got going on. We're trying to use sort of equal amounts of both, and that's the finish that we're doing. Then when you get it all nice and straight like this, and you think you've got it where you want, you can just slide your straight edge back. Don't pull it at yourself. Slide it back away from yourself so it doesn't pull the corner off, but it sort of lets it pull back in. Now I'm going to hand that out of the way. And then I'm just going to ease this edge back in just a little bit right now. Can do a little more to that later. I see I have just a little tiny bit of touch up. I could pick that up on the next coat. And there you have it. Because this is an inlaid floor and we're trying to hit the exact right height here, we've had to fill this in a little bit, and I'm just going to go around with a sanding pad and just sort of check myself. If there are any areas where I'm a little high, I'm going to take it down just a touch to make it match in perfect. I can kind of sand some of my edges in a little bit. I have to be really careful. We're almost ready to go with our next coat. So I'm going to just go around real quick, clean these edges up, make sure it matches in good with my wood. This is going to be my last chance to do that because my next pass I'm going to just be putting it on exactly the thickness of the aggregate as it pushes into this base. So this is the one little opportunity to kind of make sure I've got it just right. You'll notice I've pulled my tape and I've switched it out so there's no mix on top of the tape anymore. That way I'm not dealing with that little extra height that the glass on the tape would give me, or the sand finish on the tape might give me. And I'll just work my way around the entire area here. Now I'm just gently sanding this. I can even take the back side of my trowel. Now it has to be just dry enough to do this and make this work right. And we can kind of use the back side of our trowel to sort of shape this a little bit if we want to get it flatter. And if you're trying to flatten an area out, that can be a really good trick for you. Okay, we're just about ready to start here, and we've let the surface take up quite a bit. We even took a little lunch break. So on this, because it was thick, we got to wait quite a bit of time. Everything has all been leveled out and everything. Now I'm going to start right here on the nose of the step, and I've got two different colors on my hawk at the same time. I'm using a fairly small but a fairly stiff steel trowel. Regular concrete trowel would be just fine for this particular finish at this point. I have some Venetian trowels that I'll use when I'm doing the actual finish coat. I'm just going to kind of work my way across here, getting a nice even coat of the finish on there, and I'm kind of blending my two colors as I go, not trying to let either one be too strong on its own. I'm going to try to be fairly detail oriented here and see if I can get it right in that corner. Straight underneath. I'm going to work the top a little bit as I go at the same time. Now you can just sort of let the corners form just naturally by working the two sides at once on them. Or you can use a corner tool on it. I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Now it's really important to me at this time to make sure I'm right down flush with my wood around the perimeter as I go. Okay, now we're working our way across this edge. I'll show you how. I have an 1/8 inch radius corner tool. They make inside and outside corner tools. I'll just kind of show you these real quick. And I could use this one, but it's got about a 1/16 of an inch radius. And I'm going to try and get just a little more on this step. You don't even have to have a radius tool. You can just let it build naturally like what we've got here, and then sand it down tomorrow after it's totally dried. But I'm going to go ahead and just kind of pull this tool across here. Now if you use a radius tool, you have to be really careful. See the line that I've got there? You want to make sure that you trowel that line out immediately. Don't let it sit there for any length of time at all, or it will become a permanent part of your job. And I'm just kind of blending these two colors together as I go, but I'm being very careful not to just let them look marbled. I'm actually making sure I sort of stir them in and trowel them in so they don't have a blotchy marble effect. It'll just flow from one value of the color to the other as they mix together. You notice I'm using quite a bit of pressure to work this down into my bottom coat, because my first coat is really set up at this point, but it's still soft enough for the glass shards to push down into it and flatten out. And I just have to decide how light I want areas to be or how dark I want them to be. And I'm using a little stiffer steel for the first pass, and then I'm using a little lighter weight steel to kind of blend it all in. Done our final coat everywhere here, and we trowel it down good. Now we're just kind of going around with pull tape and clean the edges, and we're sweeping the excess, and we're very carefully can even sweep it right across the slab. Now it's dried on the surface, and it's final troweled, hard troweled, and burnished, but it is not hard enough to walk on. But we can sweep the little dust across there if we're real careful, and it won't make a mark. We just want to make sure we don't leave any of this on the wood for later, because we'll get too hard to clean it off if we do that. Okay, we're trying to zoom in and show you on a real close-up what a bubble looks like. And there's one right here that we've kind of got focused, I believe, and there's another one over there. And all we want to do when we get to those bubbles is leave them to the very last. Don't keep troweling them, move away from them, and just leave them alone. And at the very last trowels, you can trowel over them, and you kind of will probably be able to see it sort of disappear here. If you trowel it too early and you trowel it too much, you will just make them bigger, and there will be more of them. Well, now we have a shot of our finished floor. It's not dry yet. We'll be back tomorrow to sand and slurry it after it gets dry. It'll dry a little lighter than what you see right now. Okay, we're getting ready to do our next slurry coat, and we're going to sand this. So we're going to sand it not so much to bring the glass to the surface, although it will do that a little bit. We're going to sand it to get it rid of the sort of rough porosity on the surface here. If you feel it with your hand, you can feel it rough, and then when you sand it a little bit, you can just feel it go smoother. That's really what we're trying to do here, and maybe detail our edges out a little bit. You want to make sure it's really dry before you do this step. If it were wet and you pull some of that glass aggregates out, they'll make scratches in your in your surface that are really hard to get out. So you want to keep it clean as you go, and you want to just lightly sand it. And I'm using a 120 grit sandpaper, and we'll just go ahead and detail this in for you. Finished sanding our floor, and now we vacuumed it and cleaned it real good, got all of the dust off it. Now we're getting ready to seal it. We're going to be using a Cementic Sealer that was made specifically for use with the Milestone. It's a urethane. And I have a square pad that I use, and I use these pads so I can do it in a circular motion. The urethane in real good. I'm not going to leave any buildup or puddling on the surface. I'm going to work it in real good as I go. And just put a nice even coat, but no excess anywhere and no buildups anywhere. Okay, we've sealed this with a real light coat of urethane, and we've done that because as we do our next slurry coat and we're filling in the porosity, we don't want different areas where we do this to overlap and it to come out dark. And we'll kind of show you how we do this. We just want to put a little bit on at a time and do small areas. Don't try to do very much at one time. It's really important, I stress this, it's really important to get all the excess off. So I have a rag that I'm going to just use to kind of wipe it in. We just use nice white cotton rags. And I'm wiping every bit of the excess off. And then you'll do your next area. But that's why we did the sealer, so that it doesn't come out darker on the overlaps between these. So the sealer is like a penetrating stain control type sealer for us. And you make sure if you get any grit, as you pick up any grit as you're going, make sure you get rid of that, because you don't want to put scratches in it as you're going. And then when we get all the way to the end, we'll come back over the whole thing. We'll check it out real close, make sure we don't have any spots where the glass isn't showing good. We can Scotch-Brite or even lightly sand if you find some spots. Because when you do your sealers, they'll look a little blotchy if you let any buildup just kind of sit there and lay on the surface. Now all I want to do now that we've finished is I want to go over and just kind of assess it. I get one last opportunity before I put my sealer on. If I have any splotchiness anywhere, I can lightly sand it out and kind of get rid of it. And if I just see something that concerns me, you can look it over real close, make sure you feel like you've got all of your buildups off of the surface, because if you leave anything behind and you seal it, it's really hard to sand it off after you seal it. It can look a little blotchy. So just check it over real close and go over the whole floor. And then we'll be ready to do our sealers. Okay, we're going to put a real thin coat of urethane over the top of this, just to bring some of the color back. If you don't feel like you need to do that, you could go straight to your 511 sealer, which we'll do next. But we're going to do a real thin coat of this just to liven the surface up a little bit. And the object is going to be to just wet the surface with the urethane and then wipe all the excess off. Not trying to get any buildup at all, just to get enough to just sort of brighten the color a little bit. Finished our urethane coat. Now it's dried, and we're going to put a coat of impregnating sealer. This one that I'm using is called 511 Impregnator, and I just get that at the local Home Depot. And it's a fairly toxic smelling substance, so I've got my respirator ready here. And the way I like to put this on is I put a flood coat on, I come back, put a second flood coat on, let it set for a few minutes, and then go over and wipe up any of the excess puddles. I don't want it to dry as a puddle and leave a residue, and then after we're done, we'll Scotch-Brite it down and put our epoxy on. Anyway, so here we go. We're trying to put two coats on in a way that will keep the floors coated so that it can soak in and really impregnate the surface good. And then in the end, wipe off any of the excess so there's no puddles. Okay, it's been about 5 minutes since we put this on here, so I'm just going to take a nice clean cloth rag and wipe all the excess. You can see how there's some darker areas where it's really penetrated in. It'll all dry out even after, it might take it quite a while, but it'll all dry out even after a day or so. And it will have very good protection for the surface, and we'll prep our next coat. We've let the floor set for overnight now, and the 511 that we put on it yesterday is nice and dry. We're going to put one more quick coat of 511 on it, and then we'll wipe that in after about 5 minutes, get all the excess off it. That'll allow it to soak in a little bit and finish soaking in and impregnating the floor as much as it can. And for this, we wear a respirator. Before we start our epoxy, we're going to just lightly Scotch-Brite the floor to make sure there's no film of the 511 laying on the surface, that only the 511 that's left is what's impregnated the surface. So just real light, not pushing real hard, just trying to make sure we get any sediment that might have filmed on the surface off of there. We're ready to do the epoxy now. It's set for about a half hour. And we could actually leave this finish that's on here. It's a beautiful matte finish, and it would work great on a wall. But it really doesn't have a film of protection over it that would be adequate for a floor to keep it stain proof and wear resistant. So we're going to go ahead and coat this out with epoxy, and I want to show you our technique. You could put this on thick enough so that it was sort of self-leveling. We like to put it on really thin so it doesn't have much of a plastic look to it, although it still will get a bit of a gloss sheen. And we just will kind of work it in with the Bondo Squeegee. This is our technique for doing this. We like to see it go into all the porosity and kind of sit in the porosity a little bit. And then we'll kind of rag in the top after a minute. And we'll keep moving down the floor like this. On a big floor, you could have a hard rubber trowel like they use for grouting tile. But we usually use the little Bondo squeegees, and then we kind of rag it in. It's almost like buffing it in. It isn't so much you want to take every speck of it off. You just kind of want to not have any real puddles of excess anywhere. Okay, we have 2 good coats of epoxy on here now. You could put more coats of epoxy for more protection, but for what we're doing, this is plenty adequate. And I want to pull the sheen off of the epoxy. We're going to put a water-based polyurethane over this. And I like to pull the sheen off a little bit, and I like to Scotch-Brite it a little bit so that it bonds a little better. It does bond quite nice, but a little Scotch-Brite roughens the surface just a touch. This is a maroon colored Scotch-Brite. Each color of the Scotch-Brite sort of indicates the grit of that particular Scotch-Brite. And the maroon is the one that we use the most for a lot of different things. It's about the equivalent of 120 grit sandpaper. We're just going to lightly Scotch-Brite it, but enough pressure to pull the sheen, but not enough to make scratch marks in the surface. And we'll just sort of gently go over the whole surface with just enough pressure to pull this sheen off a little bit and to roughen the surface just slightly. For our next coat, we're going to put a water-based polyurethane on this. It comes in a variety of different sheens. This particular sheen is a satin. These are pretty good for floors. There's a variety of brands on the market. This is Behr. and it comes in satin, gloss, and semi-gloss, and I like the less sheen the best. And we've made a little kind of a lint brush out of some tape to pull some lint off our pad. We like the little rectangular pads because we can do nice flowing circular motions and a little bit of movement in our motion, as opposed to how a roller would have to do linear lines, and it seems to, if it does leave any kind of textural marks, they seem to be more in keeping with the way that the floor naturally flows anyway. And this, you'll want to put this urethane on, no puddles, but you want it on enough so that it gets a nice sheen. And the stir stick is here because we've stirred this up to make sure all the flatteners are mixed in well, so we get an even sheen out of this. We're going to just start with a real light coat, and you want to put it on heavy enough to get a bit of a flow with this. You don't want it so thin that you're actually kind of working it in, because if you do that, you'll end up with a high gloss again. It won't change the sheen at all, and you won't get the surface protection. You want it to be a sort of a self-leveling coat. And about the best way I can describe it is, as you pull it over, you'll notice it has almost no resistance from the friction of the product applying to the floor. And you can just make sure that you don't have any puddles, and you kind of keep a wet edge as you go, and you'll have a nice even sheen at the end of the job. It'll be a nice subtle matte finish with this one that we've got going, or satin finish as the case were. We wanted to let you see how our finished floor came out, how nice it looks, how nice the coloration movement looks. This is a recycled glass floor done as an inlay to the surrounding oak. And you can see how beautiful the color goes with the golds in the surrounding oak as well, and the darks. And it just came out really nice for us. And I'm sure you'll have a easy time getting the floor to come out the same for you if you just follow the steps that we used on this.